You had no right to sell what wasn't yours, Frank, I said, my voice barely above a whisper but sharp enough to cut through the tension in my living room. My hands trembled as I clutched the legal documents Jennifer had prepared. This ends now. Frank's face, that face that had charmed my mother 20 years ago, twisted with anger. The facade of the charming stepfather was crumbling before my eyes. You've always been so ungrateful, Sarah, he spat, pacing around my living room like a caged animal. I've been managing things while you're off playing Florence Nightingale in the middle of nowhere. That cabin was just sitting there, empty most of the time. That cabin is mine, I replied, my voice growing stronger with each word. Mine and Jennifer's. You know that. He laughed, that hollow sound I'd grown to dread over the years. It was an easy way to clear my debts. You'll thank me later. I'll thank you when hell freezes over. The words hung in the air between us. 20 years of suppressed anger, of boundaries crossed, of manipulations endured, all condensed into this single moment of defiance. I wasn't the scared 25-year-old anymore, looking for approval from my mother's new husband. At 45, I had finally found my voice. Frank moved toward the door, then turned with that smile, the one that had fooled so many people for so long. This isn't over, Sarah. Family looks after family. Your mother would be disappointed. As the door slammed behind him, I collapsed onto the couch, my heart racing. The mountain cabin wasn't just property. It was my sanctuary, my history, my future. And I was prepared to fight for it with everything I had. Flashback. The call 2 weeks earlier. I had been wiping sweat from my brow outside a makeshift clinic in rural New Mexico. The midday sun cast long shadows over the dusty landscape as I stepped away from the noise of the volunteer medical camp. 20 years as a nurse hadn't prepared me for the heat of the desert, but the work, helping those without access to health care, fed my soul in ways my regular job at County General never could. My phone buzzed insistently in my pocket. The name on the screen made my stomach clench. Frank. My stepfather rarely called unless he wanted something. Hello, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Sarah. His tone was cheerful, far too cheerful. Just thought you'd want to know. I've sold the mountain cabin. Time seemed to stop. You did what? Sold it? He repeated casually. Don't look so shocked. Well, I can't see you, but I imagine you're standing there with your mouth open. It's for the greater good, mine, obviously. He laughed. That smug laugh that always made my blood boil. You had no right, I said, my voice shaking. That cabin wasn't yours to sell. Relax, he drawled. I've been managing things around here while you're off saving the world. What's the point of holding onto something you're never around to enjoy? It was an easy way to clear my debts. You'll thank me later. I hung up before he could say another word, my hands trembling with rage. The audacity of this man never ceased to amaze me. Flashback. Elizabeth. The cabin had been my mother Elizabeth's sanctuary first. I was 15 when she married Frank, still reeling from my parents' divorce. He swept into our lives with charm and sophistication, a handsome insurance executive with a winning smile who promised to take care of us. I remember the first time Mom brought him home for dinner. I was sullen and resentful, determined to hate anyone who tried to replace my father. But Frank arrived with a bouquet of Mom's favorite lilies and a book on astronomy that he'd noticed I was reading for school. Sarah's quite the science whiz, my mother had said proudly as Frank handed me the book. The universe is fascinating, he'd replied, seeming genuinely interested. My father wanted me to follow him into banking, but I always secretly wished I'd studied astrophysics. That small connection, his interest in what interested me, had been the first crack in my teenage armor. Over the following months, as he took us to movies, helped me with my homework, and made my mother laugh again, I gradually accepted him into our lives. He's different, Sarah, Mom had said, her eyes bright with hope. He makes me laugh. After everything with your father, don't I deserve some happiness? I couldn't argue with that. After Dad left us for his 20-something secretary, Mom had been shattered. For 2 years, I watched her work double shifts as an elementary school teacher, coming home exhausted but never complaining. When Frank appeared, offering stability and charm, how could she resist? What I didn't understand then was the pattern forming right before my eyes. Frank had grown up with wealth, the son of a banker who bailed him out of trouble time and again. He never learned to manage money or delay gratification. His father's sudden death and the discovery that the family fortune had dwindled left Frank with expensive tastes and no way to sustain them. My mother, with her teacher's salary and the cabin her parents had left her, became his new safety net. Sarah, honey, Frank needs to use some of my savings for a business opportunity, she'd tell me. Or, Frank had to borrow against the house, but it's just temporary. It was never temporary. The only thing Frank never managed to touch was the cabin. It was my grandparents' retirement home, nestled in the mountains about 2 hours from our suburban neighborhood. My grandfather had built much of it himself, adding on rooms as their family grew. When they passed, they left it to my mother with the hope that it would stay in the family for generations. This place is special, Sarah, my mother said during one of our weekend trips there when I was a teenager. It holds our family's history. Some things shouldn't be for sale, no matter what. I think Frank recognized that the cabin was Mom's line in the sand. He complained about its maintenance costs and the long drive, but he never directly suggested selling it. Even he knew that would be a step too far. Until now, apparently. Making the plan, I tapped on Jennifer's name in my contacts and waited for her to pick up. We'd been friends since college, and when my mother died 3 years ago, Jennifer had helped me buy out Frank's claim to the cabin. As a lawyer, she had insisted on a formal co-ownership agreement that required both our signatures for any sale. Hey Sarah, what's up? She said cheerfully when she answered. Frank sold the cabin, I blurted out, unable to keep the anger from my voice. There was a long pause on her end. He what? Apparently, he needed the money to pay off some gambling debts, I said bitterly. He thinks he can do whatever he wants, but I know our co-ownership agreement makes that impossible. He doesn't have the authority to sell it without your consent. Jennifer let out a low whistle. That son of a bitch. He really thought he could get away with this? He always does, I replied. Mom enabled him for years. Even on her deathbed, she made me promise to look after Frank, as if he were a child, not a grown man who gambled away her retirement fund. That was the thing about Frank that outsiders never understood. Behind the charming exterior was a man who'd never faced consequences. His own father had bailed him out time and again, setting a pattern my mother continued. When I confronted her about it once, shortly after her cancer diagnosis, she'd grown defensive. You don't understand what it's like to be alone at my age, Sarah, she'd said. Sometimes keeping the peace is worth more than being right. But I understood more than she knew. My own marriage had ended 7 years ago when I discovered my husband's affairs. I chose loneliness over disrespect, a lesson my mother never learned. I'm going to need your help sorting this out, I told Jennifer. I'll finish my volunteer assignment and head back home as soon as I can. Can you pull up the legal documents in the meantime? I want to be ready to counter this when I get back. You got it, Jennifer said, her voice firm. We'll take care of this together. As I hung up, a strange sense of calm settled over me. Frank thought he'd outsmarted me, that I was too far away to do anything about his betrayal. But he didn't know who he was dealing with anymore. I wasn't the docile stepdaughter still grieving her parents' divorce. I wasn't the young nurse who'd watched my mother sacrifice her dignity for companionship. I was a woman who had rebuilt herself after her own divorce, who had found strength in standing alone. Frank was about to discover the steel beneath my scrubs. Homecoming. The flight from Albuquerque to Denver felt interminable. I'd spent my last night in New Mexico tossing and turning, my mind cycling through memories of the cabin, the smell of pine, the creak of the old wooden floors, the view of the mountains from the back porch. In my dreams, strangers wandered through the rooms, changing things, erasing the marks of my family's history. By the time the plane touched down, I was exhausted but resolute. Jennifer picked me up at the airport, her familiar face a welcome sight in the crowd. You look like hell, she said bluntly, giving me a quick hug. Thanks, I replied with a weary smile. Just what a girl wants to hear. Well, I brought reinforcements. She handed me a large coffee from my favorite local shop. Black with 1 sugar, just how you like it. As we drove toward my apartment, Jennifer filled me in on what she discovered. I checked the county records, and there's no official transfer of ownership recorded yet, she said. But I did find that Frank contacted Rocky Mountain Realty 3 weeks ago to list the property. 3 weeks? I exclaimed. He's been planning this for that long? Jennifer nodded grimly. The agent's name is Diane Morris. I called her office, but she wouldn't discuss the details with me, confidentiality and all that. But she did seem uncomfortable when I mentioned co-ownership issues. I'm going to bet Frank never told her about that little detail, I said. That would be my guess too, Jennifer agreed. Look, I've prepared a formal cease and desist letter that we can send to both Frank and the real estate agency. I've also contacted my friend at the sheriff's department, Detective Wilson. He specializes in real estate fraud cases, and he's interested in hearing more about the situation. I felt a twinge of uncertainty. Are we really talking about going to the police? Frank was, family. Jennifer shot me a sideways glance. Would he hesitate to involve the authorities if the situation were reversed? Remember how quickly he threatened to sue your cousin Michael over that borrowed lawnmower? She had a point. Frank had never shied away from using legal threats when it served his interests. You're right, I admitted. I guess I still hear my mother's voice in my head, making excuses for him. Elizabeth was a wonderful person, Jennifer said gently, but she had a blind spot when it came to Frank. You don't have to continue that pattern. When I finally arrived home, my apartment felt hollow and unfamiliar. I'd been gone for 3 weeks, and the plants were wilting, the mail piled high. I dropped my bags by the door and sank onto the couch, exhaustion washing over me. Before I could even take a shower, my phone buzzed. Frank. Well, well, if it isn't my globe-trotting stepdaughter, he said, his voice dripping with fake cheer. Finally back to reality, huh? What do you want, Frank? I asked, cutting straight to the point. Just checking in, he said, his tone smug. Making sure you're not too upset about the whole cabin situation. I mean, it's gone now, so there's no use crying over spilled milk. My jaw clenched. Funny you should say that, because as far as I can tell, it's not gone. Jennifer and I checked the ownership records. The sale didn't go through. You can't sell what doesn't belong to you. There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to let me know I'd struck a nerve. That's ridiculous, Frank said, his voice tightening. The buyer paid in cash. The paperwork is handled. It's a done deal. No, it's not, I said firmly. Jennifer and I combed the cabin, remember? Without her consent, the sale is invalid. Legally, it's still ours. His laugh was brittle. You think you're so smart, don't you? Always playing the perfect daughter, always trying to control everything. You don't know how hard I've had it, Sarah. I did what I had to do. You stole from me, I shot back. And you think I'm supposed to feel sorry for you? You've made your choices, Frank, and now you'll have to live with them. Your mother would be ashamed of you, he said, his voice low and threatening. Turning on family like this. It was a calculated blow, one he'd used many times before. The ghost of my mother's approval had been his shield for years. But this time it didn't land. No, Frank. Mom would be ashamed of you for trying to sell her family's legacy to cover gambling debts. She protected that cabin from your financial mismanagement for 20 years. I'm just continuing what she started. He hung up on me, and I stood there, phone in hand, shaking with a mix of anger and triumph. For years, I'd let Frank manipulate situations, guilt-trip me, and take advantage of my patience. Not anymore. I texted Jennifer. Just talk to Frank. He's still claiming the sale is legitimate. Time to escalate? Her reply came seconds later. Absolutely. I'll send the cease and desist letter today and set up a meeting with Detective Wilson for tomorrow. Get some rest. Tomorrow we fight back. At the cabin. The next evening, after meeting with Jennifer to review our legal options, I drove up to the cabin. I needed to see it to reassure myself it was still there, still mine. The winding mountain road was familiar, every curve and turn etched in my memory. As a teenager, I'd resented being dragged up here, away from my friends and the life I knew. But after my mother's diagnosis, the cabin became our refuge. As I navigated the familiar roads, memories washed over me like waves. The summer I turned 16, when Frank had just married my mother, and we spent 2 weeks at the cabin as a bonding experience. I'd been sullen and uncooperative at first, but the peace of the mountains had worked its magic even then. I remembered our last summer here. Mom's energy fading, but her smile still bright as we sat on the porch watching the sunset. "This place has always been my center, Sarah," she'd said. "When everything else is chaos, I come here and remember who I am." Then, in a rare moment of clarity about Frank, "I know he's not perfect. I know he's taken more than he's given. But we all have our weaknesses. His is money, mine is him." She'd laugh then, a sad little laugh that broke my heart. As I pulled up to the cabin, relief washed over me. It stood exactly as I'd left it, nestled among the pines, the afternoon sun catching on the windows. No sign of new owners, no changes to the property. I unlocked the door with my key and stepped inside, breathing in the familiar scent of pine and wood smoke. The interior was dusty but untouched. I ran my hand along the back of the sofa, remembering how I'd helped Mom pick it out. We'd spent a whole Saturday at furniture stores, laughing over ridiculous patterns before finding this simple, sturdy piece. The cabin wasn't just walls and a roof. It was 20 years of memories. It was the Christmas when it snowed so much we were stranded for 3 days. It was the weekend I brought my college boyfriend home, and Mom embarrassed me by showing him my baby pictures. It was the spring after my divorce when I came here alone and cried for 2 straight days, then woke up on the third morning feeling like I could breathe again. And it was those final months of Mom's life, when we moved her up here so she could see the mountains from her bed. Jennifer had helped me transform the living room into a comfortable bedroom, and we'd taken turns caring for Mom, reading to her, making her tea, and simply sitting with her as she drifted in and out of consciousness. "Promise me you'll keep this place," Mom had whispered one evening, her hand clasping mine weakly. "No matter what Frank says or does. This is your heritage, not his." I had promised. And now I would keep that promise, whatever it took. The confrontation. The next morning, Jennifer called with news. "I've spoken with Detective Wilson at the county sheriff's office. He specializes in real estate fraud, and he's interested in your case. Also, I tracked down the real estate agent Frank used. She's cooperating fully. Apparently, she had no idea about the co-ownership situation." "That sounds like Frank," I said, always conveniently leaving out crucial details. "The agent says the buyer hasn't paid in full yet because she flagged the transaction as unusual. She's going to provide us with all the documents." "Sarah, we've got him." Relief flooded through me. "Thank you, Jennifer. I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'd figure it out," she said. "But that's what friends are for." I was still smiling when a sharp knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. I opened it to find Frank standing there, his usual smugness replaced with a barely contained anger. "We need to talk," he said, pushing past me into the apartment. I folded my arms across my chest. "What do you want, Frank?" "Look, Sarah," he started, his tone dripping with condescension. "I know you're upset, but you have to understand my position." I was desperate. The people I owed money to, they're not the kind you keep waiting. I raised an eyebrow. "And you thought stealing my property was the solution?" "Borrowing," he corrected, as though that made it better. "I was going to make it back. Once my luck turned around, I would have paid you back every penny." I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "Your luck? That's what you're betting on. You've been gambling away money for as long as I've known you, and it's never worked out. Why would this time be any different?" His face flushed, and for a moment, I saw something I'd never seen before, genuine shame. Then it was gone, replaced by the defensive anger I knew so well. "You're overreacting," he said dismissively. "It's just a cabin. You're not even there most of the time. Why not let someone else make use of it?" "Because it's mine," I snapped, stepping toward him. "Because it's my home. You don't get to decide what I value or what I do with my property." "It was Elizabeth's first," he counted. "And I was her husband. I have rights too. Rights that you signed away 3 years ago," I reminded him. "After Mom died, you agreed to let Jennifer and me buy out your interest in the cabin, remember? You were happy enough to take that money then." He waved his hand dismissively. "That was different. I didn't need the money as urgently then." Your poor planning doesn't constitute an emergency on my part, I said firmly. The cabin isn't yours to sell. Period. His voice turned menacing. You wouldn't really go to the authorities, would you? You wouldn't ruin your own stepfather like that. I met his gaze steadily. Try me. In that moment, I saw the true Frank, not the charming facade he showed the world, but the desperate, entitled man beneath. He'd been running from consequences his entire life, always finding someone else to clean up his messes. First his father, then my mother, and now he expected me to continue the pattern. This isn't over, he said, heading for the door. Yes, it is, I replied, my voice calm but firm. I'm not Mom, Frank. I won't sacrifice what matters to me just to keep you comfortable. Those days are over. The door slammed behind him, and I stood there, breathing deeply. I felt lighter somehow, as though I'd set down a burden I'd been carrying for 20 years. The confrontation had left me shaken, but also strangely exhilarated. I wasn't just defending a piece of property. I was reclaiming my voice, my boundaries, my life. Resolution. The legal process moved swiftly after that. Detective Wilson contacted the buyer, who immediately backed out of the deal when he learned about the co-ownership. The real estate agent provided all the documentation showing Frank had misrepresented his authority to sell the property. Within a week, the sale was officially voided, and Frank was facing charges of fraudulent misrepresentation. I didn't hear from him directly again. My aunt called once, Frank's sister, who had always enabled his behavior just as my mother had. You know, he's always been impulsive, Sarah, she said, her voice gentle but reproachful. Couldn't you just work something out? He's family, after all. That's exactly why he should have respected my boundaries, I replied. And no, I'm not working something out. This time, Frank needs to face the consequences of his actions. She sighed. Elizabeth always forgave him. And look where that got her, I said, more sharply than I intended. I loved my mother, but she taught me what not to do as much as what to do. He could go to jail, Sarah, my aunt persisted. Is that really what you want? The question gave me pause. Did I want Frank to go to jail? The angry part of me thought it might be exactly what he needed, finally facing real consequences for his actions. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the man who had once helped me with my astronomy homework, hesitated. What I want, I said carefully, is for Frank to understand that he can't take what isn't his. I want him to stop using other people to solve his problems. And I want him to get help for his gambling addiction before it destroys him completely. My aunt was quiet for a moment. He is seeing someone, she finally admitted. A therapist specializing in addiction. Part of his plea agreement with the DAW. This surprised me. He took a plea deal? Yes, last week. No jail time, but probation, community service, and mandatory counseling. He also has to pay back the deposit the buyer gave him. I hadn't known about this. Detective Wilson had mentioned the possibility of a plea deal, but I hadn't heard it was finalized. That's good, I said, meaning it. I never wanted to punish him. I just wanted my cabin back and for him to understand he can't keep taking from others. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time, thinking about patterns and cycles, about the silent lessons passed from parent to child. My mother had taught me compassion and kindness, but also how dangerous it is to let others define your worth. In her own way, she'd given me the strength to stand up to Frank, even if she'd never found that strength herself. I thought about my nursing career, how I'd spent decades caring for others, my patients, my mother, even Frank in his way. Like many women my age, I'd been conditioned to put others' needs before my own, to keep the peace at any cost. It was the same pattern I'd watched my mother follow with Frank, with disastrous results. Somehow, in fighting for the cabin, I'd also been fighting for myself, for my right to draw boundaries, to demand respect, to prioritize my own well-being. 2 days later, I received a letter in the mail. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakably Frank's, elegant and precise, like everything about his outward appearance. I hesitated before opening it, unsure what to expect, more manipulation, perhaps, or a last attempt to make me feel guilty. Inside was a single sheet of paper with just a few lines. Sarah, I'm sorry. The cabin was never mine to sell. Your mother protected it from me for a reason. and I should have respected that. I'm getting help now. Not for you, but for me. Frank, no excuses, no justifications, just a simple acknowledgement of wrongdoing. It wasn't much, but it was more than I'd ever gotten from him before. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in its envelope. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. Epilogue. The early spring air was crisp as Jennifer and I sat on the cabin's porch, wine glasses in hand, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and pink. We'd spent the day cleaning, repairing a few loose boards, and planting wildflower seeds along the edge of the property. To new beginnings, Jennifer said, raising her glass. I clinked mine against hers. And to standing your ground. You know, she said, looking out at the view. When your mom first got sick and you asked me to help with the legal work for this place, I was worried about you. Worried? Why? Because I saw how Frank manipulated her, how she always gave in to keep the peace. I was afraid you'd do the same. I smiled, watching the last rays of sun slip behind the mountains. I learned from her mistakes, and from my own. So what's next for you, Sarah? You've taken back the cabin, stood up to Frank. What's the next big move? I took a sip of wine, letting the question settle. In my 20-year nursing career, I'd always put others first, my patients, my ex-husband, my mother, even Frank. It was what women my age had been taught to do. But something had changed in me during this battle for the cabin. I'm going to keep doing what I love, nursing, volunteering, coming up here whenever I can, I said slowly. But I'm also going to start that nursing education program I've always talked about. The one for rural communities like the place I volunteered in New Mexico. Jennifer's face lit up. Really? That's fantastic. It's time, I said simply. I've spent decades caring for everyone else. Now I'm going to use that experience to build something that's truly mine. And this time, I'm not apologizing for taking up space in my own life. As darkness fell, I thought about my mother's last days in this cabin, about her final gift to me. Not just the property itself, but the lesson hidden within it. That some things are worth fighting for, that self-respect isn't selfish, and that it's never too late to find your voice. The cabin lights glowed warmly against the night, a beacon of safety and belonging. Frank had tried to take this from me, but in doing so, he'd given me something unexpected, the courage to break the patterns of the past and step fully into my own life. For the first time in years, I felt truly at home, not just in the cabin, but in my own skin.